In September of 2019, Ness Fishery Board released a video online showing something rather large moving through the water in the background. The video was captured in the River Ness, which is connected to Loch Ness. So of course, one of the first things that goes through people's mind is, was that Nessie?
Loch Ness Monster!
When the Ness Fishery Board published a video online, it had the hashtag Loch Ness Monster, but they meant it as a bit of fun more than anything. The post contained laughing emojis and tagged Professor Jamel, who did a DNA study on the loch. More on that later, a lot more. The director of the Ness Fisheries Board, Chris Conroy, said it was an eel-shaped object, but he thought it was likely to be a tree branch about 3 meters in length, so close to about 10 feet. Whether it's an animal or an object is difficult to say with certainty, as the water is pretty murky, and unfortunately, like many cryptid videos, it's hard to say for sure. In fact, the sightings of the creature go back hundreds or even thousands of years and continue up until today, but we currently don't have any hard evidence that this creature exists, and yet people are still searching. When it comes to Loch Ness, there are many pieces to this puzzle, and that's what we're going to look at today. Some of the videos, the pictures, the sightings, the theories, and attempt to answer the question of why so many people believe a monster lurks in Loch Ness. Loch Ness is situated in an area of Scotland known as the Great Glen, a glen that's 62 miles, nearly 100 kilometers long, and runs from Inverness to Moray Firth on the aptly named Great Glen Fault. Inverness is a city that sits above Loch Ness, and its name means mouth of the River Ness. The loch itself is about 23 miles or 37 kilometers long, and about a mile wide at its widest. The deepest point is said to be around 230 meters, or 755 feet, though I have read in some Loch Ness Monster books it's closer to 800 feet or more. Visibility is pretty terrible, due to all the peat in the surrounding area running off into the water. Compared to many lakes of the world, it's not that large, but it is the second largest loch in the country by surface area, and in terms of overall volume, it's the largest in all of Great Britain. It apparently contains more water than all the lakes in Wales and England combined. Nice big space for that monster to swim around in, or monsters. Of course, Nessie is probably one of the most famous cryptids in the world, right next to Bigfoot, and sightings of a large creature living in the loch date back to the late 1800s, or even to 565 AD if you accept the account of St. Columba seeing a creature in the River Ness. Side note, according to Dr. Shuker's book, Still in Search of Prehistoric Survivors, the event actually took place in 580 AD, as revealed by Celtic history professor Charles Thomas. There are a couple of different translations of what happened with St. Columba, who was an Irish monk who had travelled to Scotland to convert the locals to Christianity. Now, one account is that a man was found injured, presumably by the monster, and someone had to swim out and retrieve his boat. Another account is that St. Columba suspected there was a monster in the water and decided to send out one of his followers to test his theory. Either way, a monster rose from the water and attempted to attack the swimmer. Columba, however, raised his hand and ordered the creature back to the depths, and the creature apparently obeyed. The sighting is disputed by some who think that it's been a little cherry-picked, since water creatures are a common legend for the time. And the book that contains this account was written 100 years after St. Columba's death. I also wonder too if it's more metaphorical. Those familiar with St. Patrick might have heard that he rid all snakes from Ireland, but that was more about him spreading Christianity and getting rid of paganism. I wonder if there's any parallel with St. Columba. We do have a few other sightings throughout the centuries, although there seems to be a bit of a gap of almost 1,000 years with no sighting, or at least no record of a sighting seems to exist. According to the book, The Loch Ness Monster and Others, and A Monstrous Commotion, around the year 1520, there was mention that the monster of Loch Ness had not yet been killed. This seemed to be in reference to Fraser of Glenvachy killing the last fire-breathing dragon in Scotland. A couple of hundred years later, in the 1730s, there was another sighting from workmen who were blasting out sides of the countryside to create a road when they reportedly saw two leviathans that they thought might be whales. Over 100 years later, we get a sighting that is quite peculiar and seemingly terrified the observer. In 1880, a diver named Duncan MacDonald had a frightening dive when inspecting a ship that had sunk close to Fort Augustus. When he came back up, he was so petrified that he couldn't even speak for days, leaving people to wonder what had spooked him so badly. When he finally revealed he had seen a creature that resembled a huge frog squatting on some rocks near the wreck.
I'm a frog.
He was so unsettled that reports said he refused to ever dive in Loch Ness again. I do wonder though, with the loch being so murky, how did he even see this huge creepy frog? The late 1800s seemed to have a little spike in sightings actually. There were other things scaring people around the loch around that time, like a man by the name of Aleister Crowley, sometimes referred to as the Beast. He was an occultist and a high priest in a religion he invented. He also invented the Culu Mavlik to scare locals from coming onto his land. He claimed that his Culu Mavlik gave rise to the Loch Ness Monster phenomenon. There doesn't seem to be a clear indication of this, but perhaps it played some part. Nessie sightings are rare, but what's even more rare are sightings of Nessie where she is on land. According to HistoricUK.com, in 1879, a group of school children witnessed the monster by Alderey Cemetery. The creature waddled down the hillside and slipped into the loch. Unfortunately, there is no real description of the animal other than a monster that waddled into the lake. Maybe it was a duck. But I suppose this would make it the first sighting of Nessie where she was on land. Let's take a look at the first book published about the Loch Ness Monster sightings, or maybe the first book, called The Loch Ness Monster and Others by author and former Lieutenant Commander in the British Navy, Rupert T. Gould, because his book has two other sightings from the late 1800s. Now again, this was recorded in the 1930s after some spicy sightings, so keep that in mind. Mr. Gould had been a lieutenant commander in the British Royal Navy. He had written a few books before he tackled the Loch Ness phenomenon, including a book in 1930 titled The Case for the Sea Serpent. So as you can imagine, he took an interest in Loch Ness. He rode his motorbike, called Cynthia, around the loch collecting sightings of the creature. Anyway, a few that he wrote from the 1800s were one by D. Mackenzie in either 1871 or 1872. He saw an object on the lake that he first thought was a log or upturned boat, until he noticed it was slowly moving through the water, wriggling and churning, before quickly going out of sight. The next sighting was from 1888, when Alexander MacDonald saw a creature with short stubby legs surface from the loch, propelling itself forward onto the shore. He described the creature as looking like a salamander. Speaking of, even though Rupert T. Gould's book is considered the first book on the Loch Ness Monster, published in May of 1934, there was a book published a few months earlier, in March, called The Home of the Loch Ness Monster by Colonel W. H. Lane, and he solved the mystery. The Loch Ness Monster was, in fact, a giant salamander. I will say, right away, the creature being an amphibian rather than a reptile, as we'll see later, does make more sense to me. At least it doesn't need to surface for air, but otherwise it doesn't really account for all the different descriptions. Lane's book is, well, not really a book. I mean, it's only 18 pages long. The largest known salamander is the South China giant salamander, that can apparently reach a length of 1.8 meters or 5.9 feet, and it may even be extinct in the wild. But we know a salamander can reach at least that size, but we've never found any giant salamander in the loch or the River Ness or in any of the surrounding bodies of water. Now I should mention, the reason this book and Gould's book were published in 1934 is because there were some notable sightings a few years earlier. The 1930s is really when the Loch Ness Monster craze kicked off. The first one from the 30s that I don't hear talked about as much took place in late August of 1930. At night. Well, late evening actually. A few boys were out on a boat fishing for trout at around 8:15 p.m. off Tor Point. Even though it was a bit later, the sun wouldn't be setting until 8:30 p.m. It was apparently a calm evening, or at least it was until there was a quote, great commotion with splashing and spray around 600 yards away. And then it started charging towards the boat. The following is a quote from the Northern Chronicle where the story was printed. Then the fish, or whatever it was, started coming towards us, and when it was about 300 yards away, it turned to the right. During its rush, it caused a wave about 2.5 feet high, and we could see a wriggling motion. But that was all. The wash hiding it from view. The wash was, however, enough to cause our boat to rock violently. We have no idea what it was. This sighting didn't receive a whole lot of publicity, but things were about to ramp up at the loch. There was another sighting that was reported on the 2nd of May 1933 in the Inverness Courier. The sighting was made by Aldi McKay, who reported seeing a huge beast or whale-like fish rolling in the loch while she and her husband John were driving by. However, it was the Spicer sighting that really sparked things off. There's been some suggestions that this was due to a new road being built around the loch, the A82 I guess, but it seems there was already a road, it just got some improvements during the 1920s and 30s. So the Spicer couple had been driving on this road when they had their sighting. Now, George Spicer was interviewed for a number of books, but let's go all the way back to the original letter he sent to the Inverness Courier, first published on the 4th of August 1933. In this letter he wrote, "I've just returned from a motoring holiday in Scotland, and am writing to inform you that on Saturday afternoon, 22nd of July last, while travelling along the east side of Loch Ness, between Doors and Foyers Hotel, about halfway in fact, I saw the nearest approach to a dragon or prehistoric animal that I have ever seen in my life. It crossed my road about 50 yards ahead and appeared to be carrying a small lamb or animal of some kind. It seemed to have a long neck, which moved up and down in the manner of a scenic railway, and the body was fairly big, with a high back. But if there were any feet, they must have been of the web kind, and as for a tail, I cannot say, as it moved so rapidly, and when we got to the spot, it had probably disappeared into the loch. Length from 6 to 8 feet, and very ugly." I'm wondering if you can give me any information about it, and am enclosing a stamped addressed envelope, anticipating your kind reply. Whatever it is, and it may be a land and water animal, I think it should be destroyed, as I am not sure whether, had I been quite close to it, I should have cared to have tackled it. It is difficult to give a better description, as it moved so swiftly, and the whole thing was so sudden. There is no doubt that it exists. Yours, etc. So what on earth did George Spicer and Miss Spicer, I'm sorry I can't really find her name anywhere, see on the road? Well, in the original newspaper, above the Spicer letter itself, the editor published a disclaimer saying that one who knows the habitats of otters says he has no doubt but that the animal was a large otter and that it was carrying a young otter in its mouth. Eurasian otters, Lutra lutra, do live in Scotland, but G. Spicer read this when the paper came out, and he was not happy. He sent a follow-up letter and said that it was far too big to have been an otter. So what else? It has been suggested that it was perhaps a huddle of deer lying on or near the road that got spooked when the car approached and rushed off. Definitely we have more mass now that we're dealing with bigger animals. There are 4 species of deer in Scotland, including the red deer, which can be found around the loch year-round. One of the early proponents of this idea, maybe even the first, is actually Rupert T. Gould, the author of the aforementioned book. Apparently, in his personal copy of the book, he wrote a note that said, "Were I rewriting the book, I should have omitted this case. I think the Spicers saw a huddle of deer crossing the road. RTG." Not exactly sure what the catalyst was that made him change his mind, but the deer theory has become popular. I mean, does it really match up to the description of dragon or prehistoric animal with a long neck? And he later described the color as grayish, similar to a rhino or elephant. And you think with a deer you'd notice the feet and legs a bit more. Well, perhaps his eyes were playing tricks on him. It has been noted that this was the same year the original King Kong film came out. It was released in London on the 17th of April 1933, and we know the Spicers lived in London, as the original newspaper report published their full address, and the movie was released in the rest of the UK on the 23rd of June 1933, both dates before the sighting. Supposedly, the Spicers also told Gould they'd seen the movie before the sighting. So I guess the idea goes that the Spicers saw some native animal for a few seconds dash across the road quickly, and as they had recently seen King Kong, they mistook the creature for something like the Brontosaurus on Skull Island that comes out of a lake and attacks men. Many websites will attribute this theory to the 2013 book Abominable Science by Donald Prothero and Daniel Loxton, who brought the idea further into the mainstream. It's a great book, but it seems maybe some previous Loch Ness documentaries have made the connection even earlier. King Kong is certainly an incredible movie, and the effects are very impressive for the time, and even still today. No doubt it had a huge impact on anyone who saw it back in the 1930s. Still seems a tiny bit weird though. Like in broad daylight mistaking deer for a large Brontosaurus-like animal. Now, I'm not at all saying it was a Brontosaurus or the common theory, Plesiosaur. In fact, maybe now is a good time to discuss why it is unlikely that a Plesiosaur, or small population of Plesiosaurs, live in the loch. Now, the first counter-argument to the Plesiosaur theory might be that Plesiosaurs were marine reptiles, ocean animals, that could not survive in fresh water. However, even though this may be the case for many, or perhaps most of the fossils we have found, In the last few years, new evidence has been published on Cretaceous research with the title Plesiosaurs from the Fluvial Chem group mid-Cretaceous of eastern Morocco and a review of non-marine plesiosaurs, and describes how the fossils could have been, quote, infrequent visitors from the sea, freshwater tolerant, or even freshwater adapted, as in modern river dolphins. The abundance of shed teeth in the Chem group supports the hypothesis that they had some degree of freshwater tolerance. The plesiosaurs in question were from the Leptocleididae family, smaller plesiosaurs with shorter necks. Nessie is usually portrayed with a longer neck though, but considering the Leptocleididae family may have been freshwater tolerant, it doesn't seem too unreasonable that a longer-necked plesiosaur may have had the same adaptation. But the neck itself is another problem. The Loch Ness Monster is often shown to have its neck sticking straight up out of the water, sometimes in an almost S shape, kind of like a swan. In an article for New Scientist, Dr. Leslie No published a piece titled "Why the Loch Ness Monster is no Plesiosaur," in which they stated, "The osteology of the neck makes it absolutely certain that the plesiosaur could not lift its head up swan-like out of the water. Plesiosaurs in general seem more rigid than are sometimes portrayed, and the descriptions of a creature undulating up and down don't really match up with how we predict a plesiosaur could move." Plesiosaurs were, of course, reptiles, which adds more problems. The loch isn't particularly warm, and in modern times, most big reptiles live in warmer climates, like green anacondas in the Amazon or saltwater crocodiles that inhabit parts of Southeast Asia and Northern Australia. It has been pointed out on the website plesiosaur.com that a leatherback turtle was found off the coast of Norway, though it seems that it was carried in the Gulf Stream, which on the eastern side of the Atlantic is warm. The reptiles of today are ectotherms, and while it's not really correct to call them cold-blooded, their body temperature is dependent on external sources of heat. Is that also true for plesiosaurs? Well, maybe. The oceans were warmer during the Mesozoic, but there have been papers that suggest some of these marine reptiles may have been able to maintain an internal body temperature higher than their surrounding environment. However, that would suggest a higher metabolism and therefore a need for more food. But before we get into the food question, the other big issue is that reptiles have to surface for air. There are some reptiles today that can hold their breath for a long time, for multiple hours, but the reason they can do this is partially due to them being ectotherms. According to World Atlas, endotherms need a lot more oxygen to keep their bodies warm. So maybe we should look at more endotherms to give us a rough guide at how long they might be able to hold their breath. According to the Natural History Museum of London, Cuvier's beaked whale has the record for breath holding in the world of mammals, with an apparent record of 222 minutes, or 3 hours and 42 minutes, and elephant seals can apparently go for up to 2 hours. But the reason for this, or suspected for this, is that they can go on long, deep dives to hunt for food, like squid. The loch may be deep, but it isn't ocean deep. It doesn't really seem that an animal would need the ability to hold its breath for so long. But let's be generous and say for some reason it can go for 2 hours, and for whatever reason routinely goes for 2 hours. And by this I mean elephant seals don't always go for 2-hour dives. That's just the max of what they can do. But let's say this animal does. That means it would need to surface 12 times over a 24-hour period. So there are 12 opportunities a day to see the monster? Well, most people probably aren't going to be looking at night. Daylight obviously varies from season to season, but since summer is the most popular season for tourists, let's look at those months. Inverness gets up to 18 hours of daylight in June, and even at the end of August, they still get nearly 14 hours of daylight. Scotland is rather far north after all, but let's be kind and say there are 12 hours or so of viewing time, which would mean there would be 6 chances to see the monster at the surface, assuming how long it can hold its breath. 6 times isn't that many really, but one monster on its own couldn't survive for hundreds or over 1,000 years. We need a population. There is a thing called MVP, Minimum Viable Population, and it has a 5,500 rule. But let's put that aside and take an even lower number. Leslie No said you would need at least 30, so let's go with that. But that would mean, even with a minimum population, like a very low minimum, and the ability to hold their breath for 2 hours, there would be 180 opportunities to see a plesiosaur surface every day. Now, if a lot of them are surfacing at the same time, that would bring the number down. But there would still be a lot of opportunities, and a lot of people travel to Loch Ness every year, and there are multiple different boat tours that go out on the loch. But there are even more problems. Some of these Plesiosaur Nessie sightings have them walking about on land. Could plesiosaurs walk on land? Some older paleo art and even Mesozoic documentaries depict as much. However, it seems like we don't really have evidence of this. I was recently on a live show, 90 Years of Nessie, on the Hiveside channel, and was able to put this question to Donald Prothero, the paleontologist and one of the authors of Abominable Science. Question about plesiosaurs. I know there's so many issues with that theory, but I've always wondered, do we have evidence that plesiosaurs could walk on land?
Most people would say they can't, based on the biomechanics of their flippers, which are really flexible and not rigid enough to propel them very well. And so that was, you'll see old, reconstructions by artists 50 years ago where they're shown on a beach or something laying eggs. But we now have plesiosaurs that fossils that have embryos in them, and showing they gave live birth, they didn't lay eggs, which makes sense because all whales have to do the same thing. They cannot crawl on land to give birth. And we know, of course, ichthyosaurs, several of them have fetuses that are just about in the birth canal, of course, preserved as they died. So these animals are all going to have live birth in the water. And we now have the fossils to prove that plesiosaurs did that. So,
I guess someone might say there is a slight possibility of some plesiosaur being able to walk on land, considering the amount of different species. But even if they could, I doubt they could move as fast as the animal described, charging across the road.
Yeah!
And we still haven't even covered the biggest reason why it can't be plesiosaurs. Plesiosaurs have been extinct for 66 million years. There is no evidence that plesiosaurs are still alive today, and there is a big gap between now and the end of the Cretaceous. And yes, we will talk about that pesky fish in a moment. The book, In Search of Prehistoric Survivors, has a section where Dr. Shuker questions if they really went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. He referenced a blog by another cryptozoologist named Jay Cooney, who on his blog titled Bizarre Zoology listed some examples of plesiosaur fossils that may have come from the Paleocene. The Paleocene epoch was from about 65.5 to 55.8 million years ago. Interesting stuff, but some of the examples, when I looked into them, seemed to be discoveries in the 1800s where the fossil was originally thought to be a plesiosaur, but then it was realized it was actually a different animal altogether. Perhaps a deeper dive is required, and I am intrigued, but within published papers, the consensus is they didn't make it past the KPG boundary. Of course, there is that little fish that could, but let's get off this tangent. I think it's unlikely the Loch Ness Monster, if real, is a plesiosaur. I was just saying it's hard to neatly explain the account perfectly. But sure, being impacted by King Kong and then seeing a native animal, or animals, briefly, seems like the best theory we have. But what if it was a non-native animal? What I'll explain shortly, don't worry. Well, it might actually be a while. Worry a little bit. But again, it is hard to say for certain what they saw on that day. It's one of those moments I'd like to travel back in time to. That or Bluff Creek in 1967. Regardless, the Spicer sighting in the 1930s seemed to be the spark that started the Loch Ness Monster craze. Since then, there have been thousands of sightings reported of the creature or creatures. The descriptions usually have descriptors like long neck, serpent-like, a hump, 2 humps, 3 humps, 4 humps, 5 humps, etc., etc. I mean, no disrespect to witness testimony, but when it comes to cryptids, I think we all want to see some photos or videos. Well, the first alleged Nessie photo was taken by Hugh Gray in November of 1933. The picture seems to show a serpent-type creature splashing about in water. Now, many people think this picture is an obvious hoax. One explanation is that it's simply a dog with a stick in its mouth, swimming through the water. Others have suggested it is a swan or otter that is partially submerged. Though, at this point in the video, I want to mention that while looking into the Loch Ness Monster, I stumbled upon a site called the Loch Ness Mystery on blogspot.com. I feel like I have to mention this just for the sheer amount of information on the monster you can read about. Almost any photo or topic related to Nessie has an essay you can dive into, with a lot of research that seems to be all put together by one man, a Mr. Ronald Watson, or Glasgow boy. It's incredible. Now, full disclosure, it seems that Mr. Watson is a person who does believe in some kind of Loch Ness Monster, as it says on his blog, reclaiming the Loch Ness Monster from the current tide of debunking and skepticism. If you believe there's something strange in Loch Ness, read on. So of course, if you are more skeptically inclined, perhaps the blog isn't for you, but I consider myself pretty skeptical. And even if I don't agree with everything Mr. Watson says, I have to tip my hat to the amount of research he did. He also has a variety of books, so if you want to learn more, make sure to check them out. One thing I really respect about Mr. Watson is that he has actually debunked some of the more modern photos, but more on that later. Actually, I keep saying more on that later, let's just look at it now. There was a popular photo in 2019 of a hump sticking out of the loch. This is a recreation due to copyright. The photo was pretty popular in 2019. I even saw it reported on various news stations, though on those stations they didn't really go any deeper than a new picture from Loch Ness, is it Nessie? And they didn't investigate any further. But Mr. Watson did. First, he looked up the person who took the image and discovered they were a 3D graphic artist. Okay, a bit suspicious, but doesn't necessarily mean it's a fake. Then he asked the photographer for the original photo file, and he received a photo file of an oddly small-sized JPEG. But what was more odd was that when he pulled up the EXIF data on the photo, he found out that it had gone through Photoshop. Bit of a red flag, but again, to be fair, sometimes people use Photoshop just to brighten an image or convert the file type or something. Again, Mr. Watson asked for the original photo, and again, though he got a different file type, it had also been through Photoshop. So this is all a little bit suspicious, but later, the smoking gun was found when someone else found the pattern of a catfish from a different photo matched the hump image. Again, news reports that showed the picture didn't even bother Googling the photographer. There was also drone video over the loch showing a plesiosaur-shaped creature approaching people who are in boats or on the shore. Again, people got copyright strikes, so I can't show you the original, but Mr. Watson did a similar investigation and we get a familiar story. Can't find the original file, odd details like no one in the video noticed the creature, and someone found that image and matched it up with an already created one. Anyway, returning all the way back to the first photo, the Hugh Gray one. Now, to be honest, personally, I do sort of see the dog, but just to give you another perspective, Mr. Watson doesn't think so, or at least in 2011 he didn't think so. He does update the blog regularly, but this post was from 2011, and in his post he thinks it might be genuine. One of the things he suggests as evidence against it being a dog with a stick is that he used his own picture of a dog and tried to overlay it, and it didn't seem to match up. Now, there are way more details on his blog that you can read, and the discussion in the comment section as well. But I kind of agree that the original image could be a dog, just at a different angle, as some have suggested. Now, the Hugh Gray got some attention, but it's not really the most iconic Nessie photo. That would come in April. The Spicer sighting may have been the spark, but the surgeon's photo, released in April of 1934, was the dynamite that ignited interest in the monster the world over. Printed on the front cover of the Daily Mail and on the front of nearly every Nessie book ever since, and many cryptid ones too, let's look at the surgeon's photo.
Is there a prehistoric monster in Loch Ness? Reports from the Scottish Highlands are stirring worldwide curiosity as sightings of a mysterious creature in the depths of the Scottish lake have emerged. Eyewitness accounts have described a large, long-necked creature, prompting speculation and excitement. Could it be a living dinosaur or merely a myth? Investigators and thrill seekers flock to the scene to find out.
The surgeon's photo is probably the most famous photo of Nessie, and probably pretty close to how most people think the creature looks. Supposedly taken by Robert Kenneth Wilson, a London gynecologist. I just wanted to say that many people, including myself, used to say, oh, well, he wasn't really a surgeon, he was a gynecologist. But apparently, to be a gynecologist, you have to be able to perform minor and some major surgeries. So maybe it's okay to also call him a surgeon. Anyway, it seems that this is the image most people use, though a lot of people have claimed that it is a hoax. There are actually two different hoax stories, or at least two. First is a lesser-known account that I only discovered from Dr. Shuker's book in the chapter Monsters from Ancient Waters. In 1992, a Professor Lambert Wilson, a former conductor of the Aberdeen Symphony Orchestra, claimed he had made the model, which was actually a swimming mask he made. The peculiar thing is, if that's not peculiar enough, he doesn't claim that the other Wilson, the gynecologist that took the photo, and no relation, was in on the hoax. He just happened to be there at the day with his camera and took pictures without realizing he was looking at an odd swimming mask. This claim hasn't gotten much recognition and is dubious not only for the nature of the claim itself, but the man claiming he was swimming with a Loch Ness Monster swimming hat model claims the event took place in summer when the photo was actually taken sometime in April. The second and more common story is a little bit messy, so bear with me. You can read a more in-depth version on the website Nova, but I'll try and summarize it here. So, the picture was reported as a hoax in 1994, 60 years after it was taken, due to investigations made by a man named Alistair Boyd. He was a former art teacher, and he was interested in the Loch Ness phenomena after he and his wife had a sighting themselves in the late 70s. It was a friend of Boyd, a man named David Martin, who found an old newspaper article where Ian Weatherall, son of Marmaduke Weatherall, claimed the surgeon's photo was a hoax. Now, Marmaduke Weatherall had been kind of disgraced after he was sent by the Daily Mail to search for the monster and found footprints in 1933. Sounds great. Why was he disgraced? Well, plaster casts of the footprints were sent to the Natural History Museum in hopes that the identity of the monster would be revealed shortly after Christmas. And it was. On the 3rd of January, 1934, the Natural History Museum revealed the footprints were that of a hippo. In fact, all the footprints seemed to be made by the same back foot. Turns out, the footprints were made from a hippo foot. Some sources say it was from an umbrella stand, but it may have actually been an ashtray. So anyway, that's Marmaduke. And then his son, Ian, is saying the surgeon's photo is also a hoax. Now, this clipping was published in 1975, but for some reason or another, it didn't really spread. There were two things about the 75 article that Boyd found interesting. Weatherall mentioned a man named Morris Chambers. The man, Dr. Wilson, the surgeon or gynecologist, was going to visit when he took the picture. The original photo looked like this, but we usually only see the cropped version. In fact, this original photo was apparently only published once in 1934 and was rediscovered by Boyd 50 years later. Yet, Ian Weatherall, mentioned that the photo included scenery of Loch Ness. How would Ian know this if the full photo hadn't been published? As Boyd said, either he had a very long memory or he took the picture. Now, Boyd and Martin wanted to interview Ian Weatherall, but he had unfortunately died by this time. However, they were able to track down his 93-year-old stepbrother, Christian Sperling, who also confessed the photo was a hoax. Again, it goes back to Marmaduke Weatherall wanting to get his revenge on the Daily Mail because of how they treated him when they caught him trying to hoax the footprints. Sperling built a model by attaching a head and neck onto a toy submarine. Weatherall and his son, Ian, drove to Loch Ness and took the photo, and then persuaded Dr. Wilson to claim the photo was his to add some credibility. So it seems the photo is reasonably debunked. Now, I should mention some people doubt that it could be a toy submarine. In fact, Dr. Karl Shuker makes the point that we don't have the toy sub-dinosaur creation. We only have the claims that it was a created object. And he points out most sightings are usually just claims, and people demand physical evidence. Shouldn't the same standard be applied to those claiming it was a created hoax? I think there is something to that. I mean, even in the Darren Naish book, Hunting Monsters, which is a skeptical look at cryptozoology, he does caution about jumping to conclusions about hoaxes too. But I think there is another factor to consider, and that is, what is more reasonable? Others have created replicas and have gotten pretty close to the original photo, so we know it is possible to hoax, but we don't know that it is possible that a creature that looks like this exists. So I think the hoax may be a bit more likely, but I could be wrong. Another thing that is debated about the photo is the size of the subject. According to the hoax story, it's only a few inches tall, though some cryptozoologists contend that the neck is actually multiple feet long. Hard to say for certain, but in the full uncropped image, the subject does look a little small to me. The second photo of the image does look like the subject, be it a monster or a toy, has moved a bit, which would make sense if it was a living animal, but would also make sense if it was a toy sub floating and then beginning to sink. In both scenarios, we'd see some movement. The 30s were a big decade for Nessie, but before we jump ahead to some other notable events, there is one more discovery in the 1930s that needs to be mentioned. This discovery didn't take place in Loch Ness, but rather thousands of miles away off the coast of South Africa. In 1938, a museum official by the name of Marjorie Courtney Latimer showed the world that the Coelacanth, a fish thought to be extinct for millions of years, was actually, in fact, still alive. The fish was caught by Captain Hendrik Goosen, brought to Marjorie, and recognized by ichthyologist J.L.B. Smith. A fantastic find, and it's one that cryptozoologists really like to reference. So many cryptozoology books retell the story of the coelacanth, an animal that the experts thought was extinct. And if they were wrong about that, could they be wrong about plesiosaurs and mosasaurs and dinosaurs and gigantopithecus and mammoths and saber-toothed cats and the megalodon and pterosaurs and giant ground sloths? Sounds exciting. But is that really what is suggested by the coelacanth discovery? Perhaps not. Truth is Scarier Than Fiction made a pretty perfect video about the coelacanth, aptly titled The Coelacanth and the Problem with Cryptozoology. I don't want to repeat his video to you too much, so you should just go watch it, but I would like to point out two great points. It's harder for the smaller, more fragile bones of the coelacanth to fossilize, which would make those fossils harder to find than the larger ones of plesiosaurs or non-avian dinosaurs. And also, Something I didn't realize before watching the video is that while in the 1930s we didn't have fossils of the coelacanth younger than 66 million years, the fossil record has become more complete in the last 86 years, and now we actually have coelacanth fossils from 20 million years ago, which again should be rare due to the small fragile bones of the creature, and yet, in those 86 years, still no plesiosaur fossils. The video has many other great points, and should be required viewing for any cryptid enthusiast, so make sure you check it out. I also wanted to say though, we now have photos and HD documentaries and multiple specimens of this fish, a rare fish that spends most of its time in underwater caves in the ocean. The best specimen we have of a plesiosaur is a dead, decomposing basking shark, and the photos and videos are also ambiguous at best. Sorry, I'm sure many of you are sick about hearing about it. I mention it in almost every cryptid video, and still on almost every cryptid video, I get comments that, well, I haven't heard of or considered the coelacanth. At this point, my tombstone is going to read, "Here lies a guy who did in fact consider the coelacanth." Anyway, moving to the 1950s, we get the Lachlan Stewart photo. The story is, on Saturday, July 5th, 1951, Lachlan Stewart woke up at 6:30 a.m. to milk his cows. He looked out his window, which faced the loch, and saw something large moving through the water. A friend of his, a man named Mr. Hay, was staying in the house, and Mr. Stewart called out to him, and the two men ran out of the house towards the shore. They watched the 3 separate humps move through the water, apparently traveling at a fair speed. When it passed close to the shore, Mr. Stewart, who had the foresight to grab his camera as he left his house, took this picture. I don't know if this is the first picture of Nessie with humps, but I think it's one of the first. An interesting photo, but it's kind of hard to say exactly what we're looking at, and on top of that, I've seen people using hay recreate the picture pretty closely. There was another photo in the 50s that's probably one of my favorites, and that's the Peter McNabb photo. In July of 1955, we get the photo of the humps next to Urquhart Castle. There are a few things that need to be said though. It's kind of big. Some estimates say about 50 feet long, which, how long is Nessie supposed to be? I often hear somewhere between 20 to 50 feet. That's a big spread though. Imagine if I made a how big video on great whites, and I said, yeah, so maybe some of the very big ones can possibly approach 20 feet in length. Or 50 feet, somewhere in between. Though I suppose people may respond that there may be sexual dimorphism, and that, of course, juveniles would be smaller than adults. Multiple creatures at the same time is rare, but there are some sightings of more than one Nessie, and it is speculated by some believers that the McNabb photos are multiple creatures. The thing is, though, it's also hard to say exactly what this is, and it does look a bit like waves caused by a boat when you look closely at it. There are also some claims that the image looks like it had been doctored. Understandably, if a creature does exist in the loch, it might be difficult to catch it on camera, on the surface, especially if it's an animal that can breathe underwater and doesn't have to come up for air. The next method might be underwater cameras, which sounds good, but again, the water is murky, and the lake pretty deep. At its deepest point, the loch could be around 230 meters or 755 feet, and again, some will tell you it's closer to 800 or more. That means, though, if you submerge the Washington Monument at the deepest point, the top of the monument would still be nearly 60 meters, 197 feet below the surface. What would be a good way to search beneath the surface? Well, while the 30s was the decade of gathering sightings, the 60s was the decade of searching the loch. Now, there was a book that seemed to be a bit of a catalyst that promoted the monster search. Not Rupert T. Gould's book, though, but rather a 1957 book called More Than a Legend, written by Constance Whyte. She had spent almost 10 years documenting sightings around the loch and had written a book that many had found to be very convincing, including people like Peter Scott and Tim Dinsdale, two men who formed a rocky relationship. Let's start with Dinsdale. Adventure found Dinsdale fairly early in life. When he was just a child, he was on a ship that was taken over by pirates before being rescued by the HMS Hermes. He went to an aeronautical training school. He also volunteered for the Home Guard, where he unfortunately got shot in the hand during training. He joined the RAF and did training in South Africa and what was then Rhodesia. After he worked as an aeronautical engineer until 1959, he read an article in Everybody's Magazine that changed his life forever. The article was titled, "The Day I Saw the Loch Ness Monster," and so began his obsession. He searched for more material to read and read Whyte's book, More Than a Legend. He decided to go to the loch and look for the creature himself. He also decided to enlist some help with this monster search and began writing letters to the naturalist Peter Scott. Sir Peter Scott was son of famous Antarctic explorer Robert Falcon Scott. Peter had been a naval officer, but was also a prolific naturalist and one of the founders of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, which has since been renamed to the World Wildlife Fund. He even helped design the logo. Peter also established the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust in Slimbridge. And most importantly for our story, when Dinsdale wrote to him, he was intrigued, especially when he got a copy of Constance Whyte's More Than a Legend. Things were about to heat up, and Mr. T.K. Dinsdale was about to go down in Loch Ness Monster history. In April of 1960, he conducted a lone expedition around the loch, and on the 6th day, he saw it. The monster was swimming on the surface, and lucky for him, he had a cine camera, and he took the first ever film of the Loch Ness Monster, or at least what he thought was the monster. Sorry, side note, but it turns out that years earlier, a man named G.E. Taylor filmed something in the loch. This was in 1938. Now, we don't have that film, but it was purchased by a researcher, Maurice Burton, and according to him, it was just a floating object and not an animal. Okay, back to Dinsdale. He wrote a letter to Scott, who was excited by the news. The goal of the two men now was to try and get more scientific recognition for the alleged creature so that it could be protected and studied. Scott arranged to have a group of scientists and experts view the film behind closed doors before it was released, and Dinsdale agreed. So they had a private viewing, but it didn't go so well. In letters published in A Monstrous Commotion, we see that after the viewing, Scott sent letters to the expert group apologizing for what had happened, and also sent them a copy of Whyte's book, regretting that he hadn't sent the book before. And Dinsdale sent an apology to Scott for arguing with the people in the room and explaining that they should have been more open-minded. While we don't know exactly what happened in the room, it sounds like most of the people there were left feeling unconvinced about the monster. The Dinsdale film itself isn't super clear. We have like a dark object that is moving on the water, and Dinsdale did film a boat afterwards to show the differences, compare and contrast. While the boat does look different, they kind of move in a very similar way, and it has been suggested that the Dinsdale film might just be a different kind of boat moving on the surface. Dinsdale, though, was convinced, and he wanted to get a very famous and important person involved. You might have heard of her, Queen Elizabeth II. Dinsdale knew that Scott had connections to the royal family, and he asked him to vouch for him, and Scott did, and later may have regretted it. But with a good word from Scott, Dinsdale started sending letters to the Queen, hoping that she could give some protection to the monster. And apparently, rumors and sources say she was interested. But it seemed Scott and Dinsdale had burned the bridge when it came to getting an interest from the scientific world. And perhaps Scott thought Dinsdale was becoming more of a liability. They had more disagreements at the end of May 1960 when the Peter O'Connor photo was dropped. Unlike some previous photos that were taken from far away, this photo was pretty close to the monster, like right beside it. O'Connor later told Dinsdale that he was able to get so close because of his training in the Royal Marines. We'll get to the relationship between O'Connor and Dinsdale in a moment, but let's get back to Dinsdale and Scott. This photo caused some friction because, to put it simply, Dinsdale thought it was real. Scott thought it was fake, an obvious fake. There were other problems too. Scott received a letter from the royal family complaining about the amount of letters they were getting from Dinsdale. Apparently, Dinsdale was spamming letters to the Queen to try and get royal protection for the monster. The royal family, or their representatives, weren't too happy about this, and they told Scott that he should get a psychologist on his monster hunting team. When Scott told Dinsdale to cool it with the letters, Dinsdale was offended that the royal family had ratted him out. Scott also wanted Dinsdale to wait before releasing the film to the public, but since the bridges had been burned and he had a family to feed, he decided to sell it to the Daily Mail, and he even appeared on the BBC show Panorama. Scott's opinion of Dinsdale seemed to wane a little bit, as in a private memo he sent to his friend and published in a Monstrous Commotion, Scott said, "Poor little Dinsdale is so certain he's filmed a plesiosaur that it's no good talking to him anymore." He did sort of keep him in the loop, but it seemed it was more of a courtesy than actually thinking he was useful. Scott wanted to start some serious scientific study into the monster, and so began to set up the Loch Ness Phenomenon Investigation Bureau Limited, sometimes referred to as LNPIB or just LNIB. He started it in 1961, and there were 4 directors, including Scott, of course, but also an MP named David James, and Constance Whyte, the author of More Than a Legend. Dinsdale wasn't included as a director, but he may have been a bit too busy around that time, as near the end of 1960, Scott received a letter from publishers about if he'd like to write a blurb for Dinsdale's new book. The publisher apparently included a note that said they tried to keep Dinsdale down to earth. Scott declined. He also received another letter from Constance Whyte about Dinsdale's book. She too was asked to write a blurb, but was not happy about it. Here are a few things she said. It was crowded with inaccuracies, large and small, had clearly been written in haste and in ignorance of zoology and the loch, and generally thought it would do more harm for a Loch Ness expedition than help. She also thought he'd written the book too soon, or quote, on so short an acquaintance with the subject. Gould took 2 years to complete his book. Whyte took nearly 10 years for hers. I mean, you could just try and cram as much as possible into a YouTube video over the space of a few months. Although I actually did start the script in 2020 before I even had a YouTube channel. So in a way, shockingly, Constance decided not to endorse Dinsdale's book. I know some people had some issues with Tim Dinsdale, but just to be clear, I have no problem with him at all, and I think he was a pretty interesting guy. For all the criticism that Dinsdale got for his book, he did include some interesting tidbits, like the interview he secured with O'Connor about how he took a photo of the monster. Apparently, he was only able to secure the interview because he agreed to use the scientific name Connor wanted to use for the monster, which was Nessisaurus o'connori. Dinsdale did oblige, but as pointed out by Gareth Williams and Darren Naish, Dinsdale snuck it into the acknowledgements. But what was in the O'Connor photo? Well, to me, it looks kind of like an upturned boat for the body, and I'd imagine some sort of log or branch shoved into the lake for the neck and head. In Trey the Explainer's video on the Loch Ness Monster, yes, feel free to comment that his video is better, you're probably right, but he said that it could be 3 polythene bags, based on the work by Maurice Burton. However, recreations using this method seem to look quite different. On a long and in-depth thread by Darren Naish, he spoke about the work of Dick Rayner, a former member of the Loch Ness Phenomenon Investigation Bureau turned skeptic, and he found that O'Connor was the owner of a kayak that does seem to match up pretty well with the photo. I guess since it is often considered important information, it should be mentioned that O'Connor did have an interest in the monster before that, previously even planning to hunt and kill it with a group of men with guns and explosives. But to me, in a way that almost adds credibility. I mean, I think the picture is a hoax, but someone who organizes a hunt and tries to go after the monster sounds like someone who believes it's real. I often wonder if some believers, maybe even some who've had sightings, are frustrated that others don't believe them and try to stack the deck a bit here and there to get more interest. But that's just speculation. But anyway, let's get back to Scott and the LNIB. They started a large-scale investigation with members posted at various locations around the loch, some with the top-of-the-line film cameras and regular cameras with powerful telephoto lenses that they got from the Air Force, some mounted on top of vans, and others in and later around due to complaints Urquhart Castle. During the summers of the 60s, the loch was nearly under constant surveillance, at least during daylight hours. At one point, they even got gliders from the RAF to go over the lake. Results were not great, to be honest. A few sightings here and there, but nothing super sensational, and nothing truly of note was captured on the cameras. As you can imagine though, an endeavor like this was expensive, and the LNIB was constantly struggling with money. It seemed by the mid-60s they'd run out. However, there was a stroke of luck in 1965 when an American came to London on holiday. The man, who was about 40, saw a flyer for the Scottish Highlands and how they were described as a place that tourists ought to visit to see the beautiful scenic area. So, he decided to include Scotland on his holiday plans, and when he arrived at Loch Ness, he was intrigued by the vans with the large cameras mounted on top of them. He inquired about what they were doing, and he became hooked. The man was a professor of biochemistry from Chicago University, and his name was Roy Mackal. Cryptid fans may know him from his searches for Mackal Mbembe, the Congo dinosaur, in the 80s. But before he got involved with that, he was searching for Nessie. He was able to raise $5,000 from American organizations, and he donated it to the LNIB. Not bad, considering that's worth nearly $50,000 in today's money. He also began monitoring the loch himself, and due to his scientific training, he was promoted to chief scientist in the LNIB. Speaking of big names in the world of cryptozoology, I wanted to give a bit of a cameo shout out to Mr. Bernard Schwebelmans, who the year after, in 1966, did a television program on Loch Ness, where Peter Scott climbed out of the lake in a diving suit in December. The loch isn't exactly known for being warm, and in December, I imagine it was a bit fresh. Anyway, they had a team and the funding, but still weren't getting the results they wanted. They needed to go deeper, literally. The loch is famous for being relatively deep, but all the searches were pretty much surface level, with some exceptions. The Bureau, however, needed to search under the surface. But that is challenging, especially in a body of water notorious for being murky. Which again, how did that guy see that frog? But modern problems. There have been multiple attempts to search the loch using sonar, and those have yielded various results. One of the earlier attempts actually happened a decade before. In 1954, a fishing drifter named Rival 3 recorded a reading of a large object a few hundred feet from the bottom, seemingly following the ship for about half a mile before disappearing. Intriguing but not very conclusive. Another sonar search was launched in 1968. According to the Glasgow Herald, the sonar picture shows an object several meters long and diving at about 450 feet a minute. Apparently this was a bit on the slow side for an animal, and led some experts in zoology at the time, like Colin Moore from St Andrews University and J.M. Mitchinson from Edinburgh University, to be interested but also cautious. Now, the LNIB team didn't want to just use sonar though. They wanted to get a bit more hands-on. To do that, they needed a sub, and as fortune would have it, another American, a man named Dan S. Taylor, had just the sub for the job, Viperfish, which was, I kid you not, a yellow submarine. Well, it wasn't really a coincidence. Dan Taylor was an American inventor, sub enthusiast, and Beatles fan. It's not the only connection to the Beatles and Nessie though. Remember Aleister Crowley, the Beast, the occultist who claimed his Coelacanth monster was the cause of the Loch Ness phenomena? Well, he is actually on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. There are even theories that the Sgt. Pepper song is about him, but the only real evidence for this is that the opening line, "It was 20 years ago today," could refer to Crowley's death 20 years before. But he died in December and the album came out in May, so anyway, we don't need to get into Beatles conspiracy theories. Why isn't Paul wearing any shoes? They had their yellow submarine, they were ready to dive beneath the waves, but Roy Mackal wanted to add a modification: guns. Kind of. He didn't plan on killing the creature, but he designed a biopsy harpoon, not intended to hurt the monster, but rather to collect something much more valuable than a photo or video or sonar image: DNA. Viperfish made multiple dives, but unfortunately wasn't able to find the monster, though again, very hard to see in that loch. The sub itself sounded a little bit dodgy. Apparently the hatch would often leak, and the solution to this was bring an umbrella. I found an interview Dan Taylor did for True Science Cryptozoology, where he confessed he was very scared that the boat was going to embarrass him. I would have been more afraid of, dying. Roy Mackal did also make attempts to get underwater photographs, hopefully of the creature, by using underwater strobe cameras. But it didn't really work, and it seemed almost impossible to get good underwater photos from the loch. As the decade went on, despite the efforts of the LNIB, nothing really proved there was a monster in the loch. There were a few more sightings. Apparently there was even another film taken, but again, not very convincing. And even with the boost from Mackal, as the 60s were drawing to a close, they were running out of money again. Unfortunately, Constance Whyte decided to leave the organization, as she had issues with how the whole thing was being run. In the early 70s, Scott hadn't been to the loch since his TV spot with Wavelmans in '66. Perhaps some of the steam for the search had been lost. There are some books that state Mr. Scott was more on the fence rather than a true believer, but considering his involvement, I think we can say he was at least leaning towards there being a large animal, or animals, in the lake. But it seemed his interest may have waned a lot, especially considering the lackluster results from the previous decade. However, something was coming that was going to make him a true believer. In 1975, he received a book in the mail titled The Loch Ness Story by Nicholas Witchell, but it contained a discovery by Dr. Robert H. Rines. Who? From the Academy of Applied Science. The what? And he had taken a picture of a flipper underwater in the loch. How? Now the photos were taken in 72, and they also came with sonar readings. In the middle of the night, multiple humped things came up from the depths of the lake. Now this got the blood pumping. Scott had to meet Rhines, which he did in early June at Slimbridge. And the question came up, what if we try and take more photos using the same method, which resulted in the gargoyle photo and the body photo. Scott had seen enough. He was convinced, and he gave the creature the scientific name Nessiteris rhombopteryx, meaning the Ness Monster with diamond-shaped wings, due to the original flipper photo. Now, the Daily Mail pointed out that Nessiteris rhombopteryx is an anagram for Monster Hoax by Sir Peter S., but I think this is just a coincidence. I don't think he would have spent nearly 15 years of his life searching for a creature just so he could make a weird prank with the name. In December, Nature magazine published naming the Loch Ness Monster. Finally, after years of searching, it had proven to the world that the monster was... It's never that simple, is it? The gargoyle, or alleged close-up photo of Nessiteris, is probably the one that stands out as the worst picture. It's very likely a log. The full body one seems promising at first, but there are a few issues. I think it's likely a tree trunk due to the lumps in its chest, and as many have pointed out, we are merely seeing a shape we've been primed to see. But what about the flipper? It looks to be the clearest one, but it's actually the worst offender. You know, I had heard many times that the image was enhanced, brightened up, and I always thought, yeah, so what? I mean, isn't it okay to adjust the brightness and contrast levels on an image to make it easier to see? That's not really changing the photo that much, is it? Well, here's the original photo, and then here's the computer-enhanced version. But wait, the computer-enhanced version doesn't look like the final version. The final version is super-enhanced, as if it went through another layer of custom enhancement, handcrafted human enhancement. The flipper image was kind of just manufactured from barely anything really, just the muddy floor of the lake. Also, returning again to Darren Naish, who is a paleontologist, he described how the shape of this alleged plesiosaur flipper doesn't really make sense, and he also uncovered some issues with those humped-legged creatures captured on the sonar. The sonar used was Raytheon's sonar detector that was designed to be pointed downwards, but to cover the strobe camera it was pointed sideways. And there is another key piece. Remember Dick Rayner, the believer who turned skeptic? Well, he was there on the vessel called the Narwhal, and he has confirmed that both the camera and the sonar were mobile and subject to movement. This meant they were susceptible to wind, currents, and the movement of the chains and the boat. And the whole humped creatures? Well, this has been misinterpreting the data. Let's just quote Naish. The annotations of the 1972 sonar chart show that the AAS LNIB team interpreted the marks as showing the size and shape of objects presumed to be animals. But the vertical axis on the chart marks time, not distance. Those long, thick lines show that whatever was being picked up for a given stretch of time. It does not mean that a big object, least of all a moving one in the water column, was being detected. But we have more sonar readings throughout the history of the Loch Ness search. In the late 80s, a large project was developed called Operation Deep Scan. 24 boats with echo-sounding equipment went up the loch together. Again, on occasion they detected some large things, some of which moved, interesting and inconclusive. Another large-scale scan was launched in 2003, and this one had the least interesting results, not really showing anything of significance. Nessie searches aren't just a thing of the past, though. In August 2023, another large-scale search was launched, the biggest search in over 50 years, with over 100 volunteers observing the loch, and 300 more who had signed up to monitor the loch via livestream. They had drones flying over the loch, some even fitted with infrared cameras, and they had hydrophones in the water. Nessie, however, wasn't proven to be real. Sure, we had a few odd photos and some weird noises, but that's about it. By the way, some of you might be saying, hold up, you just skipped over all those sonar readings. They could be something. Could be. Maybe even a large animal. Maybe. While the Rhine sonar image can kind of be explained away, there were others that did seem to show something underwater moving. But we don't know what it or they were, as in we don't know if they were even living animals. And if it was, sometimes even groups of fish can appear to be one large animal. If you've seen my Cryptid Theories video, you would have seen the incident in 2022 when it seemed that there was a 50-foot shark being picked up on sonar before it turned out to be a school of Atlantic mackerel. Now, I have seen certain sonar images that suggest the object is uniform, one singular object, moving through the water, and somewhat large. Now, maybe this is an animal, but then again, how do we know it's not some debris or tree branch or anything being pulled by a current? There is a counter, though, to all of these sonar scans, and that is that Nessie could easily hide in all the caves. Some theorize that Loch Ness contains underwater caves and caverns, and perhaps some of them lead to the ocean. Such caves, though, have never been found, though the lake is connected to the ocean by the River Ness, the river where we saw this. The river isn't particularly big, though. Could a group of large creatures swim up the river into the loch after it was formed thousands of years ago? It's another big issue. How did they get there? Constance Whyte did have a theory for this. She thought that during the early days of the loch formation, there were larger openings to the ocean, which was used by the monsters' ancestors to enter the lake and then stay there, I suppose. At least, that's the theory. But then, what are these animals eating? Well, all the fish, of course. The food question is a bit of a contentious one, like all the questions on this, I suppose. When you read a skeptical book about the Loch Ness Monster, you get the sense that there's barely anything living in the loch. And then in pro-Nessie circles, it sounds like the lake is teeming with a bounty of food for all the Nessies to eat. A variety of fish can be found in the lake, including eels, char, trout, and salmon. But is there enough? Depends on who you ask. The Loch Ness Monster Mystery blog has an extensive post that seems to suggest that the loch has plenty of biomass to eat, while on the skeptical end of the spectrum, with books like Abominable Science, it states that plesiosaurs would require more food than the loch can provide. Indeed, extensive biological sampling and sonar surveys by Adrian Shrine and other researchers have revealed that the loch has a total fish population of only about 22 tons. There's also a quote from Shrine himself that states, "Predators upon this biomass should not amount to more than approximately a tenth of the gross weight. Thus, we have available a total of approximately 2 tons of monster, equivalent to scarcely half the weight of a 36-foot, 13-meter whale shark. In fact, 2 tons divided into an absolute minimum viable population of, say, 10 creatures would give an individual weight of only 200 kilos, 440 pounds. And that's a pretty low minimum population. I mean, I thought 30 was low, but there you go, some people say 10. But this number, as in the number of fish biomass, is contested on the Loch Ness Monster mystery blog. Quote, "Sonar contacts do not regularly show large sonar hits amongst these open water fish, so this is not a regular hunting ground for Nessies except in 2 speculative circumstances. Sonar blind spots, e.g. within the top few meters and sides, and 2 juvenile Nessies of up to a few feet across which would be lost in the fish noise." Now the post is much longer and much more in-depth than this, so feel free to go and read it afterwards. I mean, I guess I would like a more modern survey that was extremely comprehensive, or as extremely comprehensive as possible. But as it stands, it seems to me that a lake in the Scottish Highlands doesn't seem to be a particularly good environment for a population of large predators. But are they even predators? If real, what even are they? The most obvious one is the plesiosaur, a marine reptile with a long neck that roughly fits the description of some sightings. But as I already stated, there are a lot of reasons that the plesiosaur theory doesn't really fit. Roy Mackal released a book in 1976 titled The Monsters of Loch Ness, in which he states he thinks the monsters could be large, unknown amphibians. Some copies of the cover have a drawing of a multi-humped, amphibious creature. I mean, that solves the problem of it having to come up to the surface, but it seems very speculative, and we don't have evidence that these creatures are real. Giant salamanders are real, but not found in the continent, and even the biggest one in Eastern Asia doesn't come near the Nessie-sized claims, and they don't really have long necks or multiple humps. Roy Mackal actually changed his mind on what he thought the creature could be, and later thought they were a kind of Basilosaurus. But this would also have to surface, as would mosasaurs, which I've also seen as an explanation. Again, they would have to surface routinely for air, and as far as we know, sneaky fish not included, these creatures are extinct and have been for millions of years, as is Tully monstrum, which has been extinct for a few 100 million years. But author F.W. Holliday thought this was what the monster could be. Tully monstrum was also not particularly big. It is thought it could reach a max length of about 35 centimeters or 14 inches, which is a lot less than the 50 or 20 foot Nessie, or claims of Nessie. But then again, if the average male height is 5'9", and Robert Wadlow was almost 9 feet tall. And we also have to keep reminding ourselves the lake itself was formed during the Ice Age a few thousand years ago. So unless they got in early or got up the river, it's sort of tricky to get in there. What about a shark? In the 5th season of the show River Monsters, the show's host, Jeremy Wade, suggested the origin of the Loch Ness Monster could be a Greenland shark. A shark wouldn't have to come up for air. Greenland sharks live in cold water and can get very large, perhaps over 20 feet in length, and can live for perhaps hundreds of years. You know, when I saw the original clip on the YouTube channel years ago, I thought Wade was on Loch Ness when he fished out the shark. I thought, wow, he'd solved it. But he wasn't at Loch Ness. He was just suggesting the loch could be similar. No shark has ever been fished out of the loch, though. In all the decades and centuries people have fished there. Some believe it could be a large catfish. A photo from Apple Maps in 2014 seemed to show that a huge catfish was in the lake. But that's been pretty much debunked, and it was caused by a ship. I do know people who own catfish, and they will hide at the bottom of a pond for years and then pop up one day, just having grown really big. But again, no evidence of them in the lake. Speaking of big fish though, what about sturgeon? They get fairly big. The European sturgeon can possibly grow close to 20 feet. And I do think for many places in the world, sturgeon is a likely candidate for lake monster. By the way, check out the podcast channel if you want to hear me and my co-host debate a bunch of other lake monsters. I even put up a supercut of all the times we've debated them so far. So make sure to check it out. But as for Loch Ness, maybe. The thing is, the European sturgeon hasn't been confirmed to be in the lake, but it has been found around the Bewley Firth, which is connected to the River Ness. So perhaps there were theories that the monster was a giant squid, but giant squid or Architeuthis are marine animals, and they don't come up to the surface unless they are sick or dying. Some say it was whales, swimming upside down. If you know, you know. But a whale would need to regularly go to the surface for air, and if a whale or population of whales was in the loch, surely people would have figured that out. But there's another fish we haven't discussed yet, the eel. In 2019, a DNA study was conducted on the loch taking multiple samples. They didn't find DNA of marine reptiles or sharks, not even catfish. What they did find a lot of was eel DNA. For some years, there has been the idea that Loch Ness contains a very large eel, or eels. Professor Neil Jamel, a geneticist from New Zealand's University of Otago, was one of the people who led the DNA survey of the lake. When asked about the idea of giant eels, he said, "Our data doesn't reveal their size, but the sheer quantity of material says that we can't discount the possibility that there may be giant eels in Loch Ness." But how big is giant? How large are the eels? Well, the largest known species of eel by both mass and bulk is the European conger, growing to approximately 2.1 meters or 7 feet. Now, some say they get closer to 3 meters or 9 feet, and it has an overall mass of 72 kilos or about 159 pounds. Some moray eels can grow longer, while not weighing quite as much. The longest being the slender giant moray at up to approximately 4 meters or 13 feet, or at least a specimen from 1927 was supposed to be that big. The eels that have been documented in Loch Ness so far, though, are European eels that don't really grow much longer than a meter. The European conger, again the largest species by overall mass, does inhabit the North Atlantic around Scotland. Could a particularly big one, or few, be living in the loch, or at least periodically visiting? Well, not really, because the European conger isn't found in freshwater. It's a marine fish. Could there be another unknown species of eel? A big one? Is Loch Ness the right habitat for making giant eels? Well, I don't know about that, because in a paper in the Journal of Fish Biology, it was determined that the optimum growth temperature for eels was 22 to 23 degrees Celsius. Loch Ness is usually much colder. Even in the summer, it generally doesn't go above 17 degrees, and it's about 5 degrees in winter. Eels do like to travel though. Those smaller European eels that travel to the loch come from the Sargasso Sea, nearly 7,000 kilometers or 4,350 miles away. Perhaps the big eel does its growing somewhere else before entering the loch through the River Ness. Well, I'm a bit perplexed that we have found all these smaller eels, and yet we have never found this giant super eel in a pretty popular surveyed location. The other thing is that, well, the super eel theory isn't new. Since the 1930s, there have been theories that Nessie was a giant eel. And then the other thing is, I feel like the giant eel theory got a little too much credit when this paper came out. We've known that eels lived in Loch Ness for a long time. I was trying to find out when eels were discovered in Loch Ness. It's sort of hard to find a particular date, and I'm not too sure, but there are records of eel fisheries in Scotland going back to the 1500s. So I think it's a safe bet that we've known there are eels in Loch Ness for hundreds of years, maybe longer. And this survey just confirmed that, yep, still eels there. But the media does what it does best and blew it out of proportion. I mean, all we really learned were that there were eels in Loch Ness. How big though? Well, we can't really tell from the DNA. So you can't rule out that there are giant 50-foot eels? Like, nobody is going, well, we don't know how big, so they could be average or slightly smaller than average or even slightly bigger than average. No. Bigger is better. And I think this convinced a lot of people. I was scrolling through some comments on the LNM. I should have used this abbreviation sooner. And someone commented that the LNM is a giant eel. Not that it could be or might be. They stated as an absolute fact that the LNM is a giant eel. Someone responded to this with, lol, no it isn't. But then the OP responded with, lol, read this article, dumb, and linked a BBC article, the same article that talks about how they found eel DNA, and who knows how big the eel could be. European eels don't really get super long. In fact, almost in response to the hype about giant eels in Loch Ness, a man named Flo Foxon put out his own paper analysing the eels caught in Loch Ness between 1970 and 71 and comparing the numbers with European eel catch data from the lakes in Belgium, and realised big eels in the loch weren't very likely. He stated that finding an eel 1 meter in length in the loch was 1 in 50,000. For context, some of the longest ones, as in exceptionally long European eels, were maybe 1.33 meters or 4 foot 4 inches. And while he says some sightings could be eels swimming close to the surface, he also states, quote, super eels are unlikely explanation for eyewitness reports of the very largest alleged animals. Then what the heck is it? If I keep trying to pull the ideas apart, what is the phenomenon? What are people seeing? Why are they believing? Well, multiple things. Some could be animals, otters and deer swimming in the water. There are even theories that circus elephants being let into the loch to cool down and get a drink could be responsible. I think this originally came from Dr. Neil Clark, curator of paleontology at Glasgow University. He found evidence that travelling circuses on the way to Inverness would stop off by the loch and let their animals into the water. There was even speculation that the surgeon's photo was actually an elephant with its trunk sticking out. But with the original uncropped image, it doesn't seem like an elephant. But perhaps some sightings were caused by circus animals. There's also birds. Believe it or not, some people who thought they originally saw the monster later returned to the site and realized they had misidentified some cormorants. Then there are waves and wakes from boats, floating logs and debris, and things being launched to the surface from a buildup of methane. In fact, Dr. Morris Burton, who originally thought there were plesiosaurs in Loch Ness, later went on to change his mind and did experiments in an aquarium with sheets of algae and bubbles of air. And he was able to make it rise to the surface, looking like multiple humps. And not only did it rise, but when it got to the surface, it also moved across before sinking again. But I know what you're thinking. Sure, some of it could be misidentification and pareidolia and hoaxes. Maybe that even accounts for a lot of it. Maybe that accounts for most of it, but not all of it. Not all of the sightings. Thousands and thousands of people can't all be wrong. I don't know exactly how many sightings we have, but I've seen the 10,000 number being thrown around a lot. And I have to wonder, is that the number? Like, if we had 9,000, could we chalk it up to natural phenomena? Or 8,000? What is the threshold when we have to say the number is too big to not be a large monster? What number is too high to not be natural phenomenon? Let's do a little thought experiment. Let's just say that there definitely isn't a monster. Just hypothetically, let's say there 100% wasn't. Now, what would happen if some people in the beginning made a mistake, were influenced by a movie or mistook some natural phenomenon for an unknown massive beast, and the media gave it some coverage and a bit of hype? Couldn't we expect it to spiral? Surely that would draw the curiosity of others. And the thing is, misidentification and pareidolia are known, studied phenomenon. It is a human trait, and with millions of humans showing up, a percentage, primed with monster stories, are bound to make mistakes. And let's not forget, there are also hoaxes thrown in there too. There are people trying to trick you. Doesn't that scenario sound more likely than a large creature hiding in one of the most searched lakes on the planet? Let's not forget too how the media hype fuels the fire and twists and tweaks stories. A DNA study showing that there was no unknown monster or reptile in the lake, just the fish and wildlife we already knew was there, turns into Nessie has been proven to be a giant eel. You know, that is something I've noticed that's a little odd when I read some cryptozoology books. Of course, many argue for the case of certain cryptids, but I've also noticed that when they discuss known animals, they sometimes give odd details, particularly in regards to size. One even made the claim that the whale shark could reach lengths of 100 feet, making it longer than the longest scientifically measured blue whale. Quite a claim, though it is in a book of extraordinary claims. But I don't think it's any coincidence. These claims can often go hand in hand. After all, some consider known animals that grow to huge, unverified sizes to be cryptids. I mean, we know eels aren't good enough. It has to be a huge super eel. And maybe that's not good enough. It has to be a prehistoric reptile or extinct mammal. You know, I've been critical of the Discovery and Animal Planet mockumentaries about mermaids and megalodon and everything else, but there is a reason they were made, or more to the point, there is a reason they did record views for the channel. People are fascinated and drawn to these topics. There seems to be these desires wired into us when it comes to wildlife. Bigger is better, mysterious over the mundane, and the thrill of a monster over the simplicity of a regular known animal. After all, the creature or animal of Loch Ness sounds a bit too boring. The people want a monster. Combine that desire with hoaxes, misidentification, and other theories, and it doesn't really matter how many times we do sonar scans of the lake, how many reasonable explanations are given, or how many hoaxes are debunked. People will still believe. The inky waters of Loch Ness are like a Rorschach test. And when asked, what do you see, many will say a monster, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Before I go, I want to give a massive thank you to my patrons and members. I really, really appreciate the support. I also want to thank all of you, all of my subscribers, and everyone for their patience. But I also want to say something else. Even though I'm skeptical, I could be wrong of course, but also I just wanted to say I do have a lot of respect for all those pioneers and trailblazers who went out to the loch and did the work, did the interviews, surveyed the waters, and used the technology that they could to discover as much as they could. Scott, Dinsdale, Whyte, Mackal, Gould, and many, many others. Even if I don't always agree with their conclusions, I'm only able to be critical because I'm standing on the shoulders of all these giants and all the groundwork that they did. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day.